It is 4:47 in the morning in Butte, Montana in 1912. The shift whistle hasn't blown yet, but the boarding house kitchen is already going. A woman named Mary Dolan, Irish-born, 41 years old, has been awake since 3. She is packing a tin pail, a dinner bucket, for her husband Patrick, who will descend 2,400 feet into the Anaconda copper mine and stay there until the sun is already setting again. She moves without looking. She has done this 800 times. She knows exactly how many calories a man needs to swing a single jack drill in 100-degree heat at the bottom of the earth for 12 hours straight. The food science community would not figure this out for another 60 years. Mary Dolan figured it out empirically by watching her husband come home trembling when she packed too little and watching him waste when she packed wrong. What Patrick Dolan carried down into that mine was not gruel. It was not slop. It was not what you'd feed an animal. It was engineered. Not with instruments, with generations of accumulated knowledge passed woman to woman, immigrant to immigrant, catastrophe to catastrophe. The men in the mines burned somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories a day. They needed heat-stable food because there was no cold storage underground. They needed high-fat food because fat sustains energy over 12 hours in a way that simple carbohydrates cannot. They needed food they could eat in 15 minutes in the dark, with dirty hands, sitting on a plank above a flooded shaft. They needed food that would not make them sick in heat that could hit 120 degrees at the deeper levels. Number 20 on this list was so calorie-dense that modern nutritionists would classify it as an extreme athlete's fuel. Number 14 was declared unsanitary by state health inspectors in 1923 and was nearly destroyed by that ruling, only to be quietly vindicated by a university food science study in 1987. And the food at number 1, the one Mary Dolan made every single morning without fail, is the one that disappeared so completely that most American grandchildren of miners have never tasted it and never will, because the knowledge of how to make it correctly died inside a generation that is almost entirely gone. The mining companies did not erase this food. Progress erased it. The lunch pail gave way to the company cafeteria gave way to the vending machine. And somewhere in that chain of convenience, everything that Mary Dolan knew was quietly thrown away. This is what she carried. Number 20, dripping bread. Before the shift, before anything else, there was the bread. Not the sandwich, just the bread. Spread thick with beef dripping. The rendered fat collected from the bottom of the roasting pan. Cooled overnight in a ceramic crock until it solidified into something the color of pale amber. In the mining communities of Pennsylvania's anthracite coal country in the 1890s, dripping bread was the first thing a miner ate and the last thing he thought about when his hand started shaking at hour 10 underground. A 2-inch slice of dense rye or sourdough spread with a 1/4 inch of dripping and dusted lightly with coarse salt cost almost nothing. Beef dripping was the byproduct of any roast and was never thrown away. But it delivered approximately 400 calories in a form that digested slowly and steadily over several hours. The technique mattered. The bread had to be day-old, dense enough that the fat didn't make it collapse. The dripping had to be clarified, all the gelatin and moisture cooked out, or it would turn rancid in the heat of the mine within a few hours. Women who packed miners' pails understood clarification intuitively. They rendered the dripping twice, poured off the cloudy liquid beneath, and packed only the clean white fat. In 1907, the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry cited dripping bread specifically in a report on miner nutrition as a food of low cultural standing, unworthy of working men, and recommended boiled oats as a substitute. The miners ignored this. The boiled oats went cold and gray by hour 2. The dripping bread lasted all day. Number 19, hard-boiled eggs in brine. The egg was the perfect mining food on paper. Self-contained, protein-dense, calorie-sufficient, and completely shelf-stable in its shell for a full shift in moderate temperatures. The problem was the temperature. At the deeper levels of the copper mines in Arizona and Nevada, the mines that chased ore down past the 1,000-foot mark in the 1880s and 1890s, ambient temperature underground could exceed 100 degrees. A plain hard-boiled egg left in that heat for 6 hours was a genuine health risk by the end of the shift. Miners working the Comstock lode in Virginia City, Nevada, had figured out by the mid-1870s that eggs kept in a small jar of heavily salted brine, a ratio of roughly 1 part salt to 6 parts water, stayed safe and palatable significantly longer in the heat. The salt penetrated the whites slightly, giving them a firm, briny quality similar to a very lightly pickled egg. The yolks, insulated by the whites, remained intact and rich. Number 18. Pasties. The Cornish pasty is the one miner's food that never fully disappeared, and yet it has been so thoroughly stripped of its original meaning that what survives is barely a ghost of what it was. In Cornwall, England, and in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where Cornish miners came in the 1840s to work the copper and iron deposits around Keweenaw and Marquette, a pasty was not a casual lunch. It was an engineering decision. The thick, crimped rope of pastry running along the top edge of the pasty was not decorative. It was a handle. Miners' hands were covered in copper dust, arsenic residue, and rock powder that could not be fully cleaned underground. The crimped edge was held, the filling was eaten, and the crust handle was thrown away or saved for last if food was scarce. The pasty's D-shaped pocket design ensured that the filling, traditionally beef skirt, turnip, onion, and potato, seasoned simply with salt and pepper, stayed in place when the pasty was carried upright in a bucket, and that the steam from the hot filling was retained through the descent, keeping the interior warm for hours. Number 17. Boiled salt pork with potatoes. This one deserves a more respectful introduction than it typically receives. Salt pork and potatoes cooked together in a single pot, the pork rendering its fat into the water, the potatoes absorbing it, was the foundational hot meal of the British and Irish mining immigrant, and it traveled intact from the coal fields of Wales and County Durham to the anthracite regions of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, by the 1850s. The economics were brutal and precise. Salt pork belly in Philadelphia in 1885 cost approximately 4 cents a pound. Potatoes cost 2 cents. A family of 4 could eat a nutritionally complete hot dinner for under 15 cents. The pork provided fat and salt, both essential for men who sweated out sodium at extreme rates underground, and the potatoes provided complex carbohydrates and, critically, potassium, which prevented the cramping that afflicted men working in wet conditions near flooded shafts. Something needs to be said here about the physics of what these men were doing, because the food only makes sense against that backdrop. A miner working a hand drill in hard rock, what the industry called single jacking, burned somewhere between 400 and 500 calories per hour. A 12-hour shift underground meant a caloric expenditure of 5,000 to 6,000 calories on the heavy days. For comparison, a Tour de France cyclist burning through a mountain stage burns approximately 6,000 calories. These men did that 6 days a week in temperatures that could hit 130 degrees at the deeper levels of the Nevada silver mines, with air quality that would register as dangerous by any modern standard. The food they carried was not comfort food. It was fuel formulated for an athletic event that most people today could not complete at all. Every entry of fat, every dose of salt, every calculated balance of slow-burning carbohydrate was a decision made by women who understood thermodynamics not as a science, but as a survival practice. The condescension with which health inspectors of the era characterized this food, low, dirty, culturally deficient, tells you nothing about the food. It tells you everything about the inspectors. Number 16. Tea-soaked oatcakes. The oatcake is a Scottish and north of England tradition that crossed the Atlantic with the miners who came from those regions to work the coal and iron deposits of western Pennsylvania and the Lake Superior Basin in the mid-1800s. An oatcake is not a modern granola bar, not a soft cookie. It is a hard, dense, relatively thin disc made from oatmeal, a small amount of fat, a pinch of salt, and just enough hot water to bind the mixture into a dough that can be pressed flat and baked dry on a griddle until it is firm and stable. The texture, when properly made, is somewhere between a thin cracker and a shortbread. Dry enough to survive in a tin bucket for 12 hours without softening or crumbling. Hard enough to function as a vehicle for dripping or a piece of hard cheese. The tea connection was specific and practical. Miners carried tea in their flasks. strong, black, heavily sugared, sometimes mixed with condensed milk if it was available. And the oatcake could be dipped in hot tea to soften it slightly and make it more palatable when hands were too cold or too damaged to chew properly. More significantly, soaking the oatcake briefly in the tea introduced sugar rapidly into the bloodstream, a fast carbohydrate hit, while the fat in the oatcake itself provided the slow-burning follow-on energy. The combination of fast and slow energy delivery was, again, something food scientists would not formalize until the concept of the glycemic index was developed in the 1980s. Scottish miners in Fife and Lanarkshire figured it out empirically around 1840 and brought the practice with them to America, where it persisted in mining communities in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, through the early 1900s, before slowly disappearing as commercial biscuits and crackers became cheap enough to replace handmade oatcakes. Number 15, Miner's Rabbit. Despite the name, this dish rarely contained rabbit. Miner's Rabbit, known in some Pennsylvania communities as Miner's Rarebit, was a dense, savory mixture of sharp cheddar, ale or beer, dry mustard, and a small amount of flour, cooked until smooth and thick, then packed in a small tin container and transported into the mine. Underground, miners would hold the sealed tin near the carbide lamp or the steam pipe that ran along the tunnel wall until the mixture reheated to a pourable consistency, then eat it on bread or directly from the tin. The dish was a deliberate adaptation of Welsh rabbit, the British pub classic of melted cheese and beer on toast, stripped down to its portable essentials by communities who needed everything they ate to survive conditions that a pub kitchen never had to consider. The ale in the mixture was not incidental. A small quantity of beer or ale in a cheese sauce inhibits the proteins in the cheese from seizing and becoming grainy when reheated, functioning as an emulsifying agent. Modern cheese sauce recipes sometimes add a splash of white wine for the same reason. The miners who developed this formula didn't know the chemistry. They knew that the cheese turned grainy and unpleasant without the ale, and didn't without it, and so the ale went in. The dry mustard served a similar stabilizing function. Mustard powder contains natural lecithin, which is also an emulsifier, and it added the sharp, pungent bite that made the mixture satisfying rather than merely filling. Number 14, lard cake. The name sounds wrong. The name sounds like something a food writer invented to be provocative. It was not invented by a food writer. Lard cake, also called fat cake in some Appalachian coal communities and greasy bread in others, was a dense, slightly sweet quick bread made with lard, flour, sugar, baking powder, and sometimes dried fruit. Baked in a heavy pan until the exterior was dark gold and slightly crisp, and the interior was moist and rich with rendered pork fat. It was not a delicate thing. It was approximately 450 calories per 2-inch slice. It stayed moist at room temperature for 12 to 14 hours. It did not crumble, and it tasted, when made correctly, like a slightly savory pound cake with a crust that had genuine structural integrity. The technique was straightforward, but required precision. The lard had to be fresh rendered and cool. Not refrigerator cold, but room temperature cool. Or it would not incorporate properly into the flour, and the texture would be wrong. The baking had to be at moderate temperature for a long time, not hot and fast, or the interior would be undercooked and gummy while the exterior was burned. Women who made this regularly knew these details the way a pastry chef knows them. The result, when made correctly, was food that a man could eat quickly in sections over several hours, that provided sustained energy without the blood sugar crash that comes from the white flour white sugar baked goods that replaced it. Number 13, black bread with dripping and onion. This entry belongs to the Eastern European miners, the Poles, Slovaks, Ukrainians, and Czechs who arrived in the Pennsylvania and West Virginia coal regions in large numbers between 1890 and 1915 and brought with them a food culture that the Anglo-Irish mining establishment regarded with open contempt. Black bread, dense, sour, made from rye flour that had been naturally leavened over several days, spread with rendered pork or beef fat and topped with thin-sliced raw onion, was the daily meal of miners from Krakow, Lviv, and the Carpathian villages. translated intact into the dinner buckets of Hazleton, Shamokin, and Nanticoke, Pennsylvania. The bread kept for days without molding. The fat protected it from drying. The raw onion contributed quercetin and vitamin C at levels that the bread and fat alone did not provide. The sourness of the bread was not accidental and not simply a matter of taste preference. Rye sourdough's lactic acid fermentation produces a bread with a lower glycemic index than wheat bread. It releases glucose more slowly, providing steadier energy over a longer period. It also produces organic acids that function as mild preservatives, extending the bread's safe life in warm environments. The miners who ate it didn't know the word lactic acid. They knew the bread lasted and kept them going. The onion was partly nutritional. Polish and Slovak food traditions had understood for generations that raw allium supported health in workers exposed to dust and damp, and partly cultural. The smell of raw onion in a mine tunnel, in communities where everyone ate the same food, was not an affront. It was a signal that dinner was happening. It's worth pausing here to note what is happening to the food as we move through this list. The entries are not random, they form a pattern. Every one of these foods was dismissed by the reformers and regulators of its era as a marker of cultural backwardness, poverty, or ignorance. The beef dripping was unhealthful fat. The rye sourdough was foreign. The raw onion was unsanitary. The lard cake was a product of low domestic standards. What the reformers were measuring was not nutrition. They were measuring class. The food that sustained men who worked at the physical limits of human endurance was being evaluated by inspectors who sat at desks in warm offices. And the evaluation had nothing to do with whether the food worked. It worked. It worked extraordinarily well. The judgment passed on it was entirely about who was eating it and what that was supposed to say about them. The food was not inferior. The framework used to judge it was. Number 12, peas pudding. Peas pudding is old enough that it appears in English nursery rhymes, which is almost always a sign that something has been poor people's food for so long that it became part of the cultural furniture before anyone thought to write about it seriously. It is yellow split peas, soaked and boiled until completely soft, mashed with salt and a quantity of rendered fat, pork dripping most traditionally, into a dense, smooth paste that was packed in a cloth-tied bundle or a sealed tin and carried as part of the miner's bucket. In the northeast of England, Durham, Northumberland, County Durham, it was standard miners' fare through the 19th century. When the Durham and Northumberland miners emigrated to the coalfields of Pennsylvania and Ohio in the 1840s and 1850s, peas pudding came with them. The protein content of yellow split peas is approximately 25 grams per cooked cup, comparable to meat, and the combination of legume protein and pork fat provided both the sustained energy and the amino acid profile that underground work demanded. Peas pudding also contained significant amounts of folate, zinc, and iron, nutrients that the inspectors of the era associated only with meat consumption and not with legumes they considered peasant food. The pudding was typically made in bulk on Sunday and carried through the week. It remained palatable cold and firmed up when cold into a sliceable block that could be eaten on bread or straight from the tin with no utensils required. Number 11. Suet dumplings in broth. The woman who made suet dumplings for miners understood something about fat that took the rest of the culinary world a long time to articulate. Suet, the hard white fat from around the kidneys and loins of a beef animal, has a melting point significantly higher than most other animal fats. When incorporated into a dumpling dough and cooked in simmering broth, it does not melt away. Instead, it distributes evenly through the dumpling's interior and remains in suspension, creating a texture that is simultaneously dense and tender, and that provides caloric energy in a form that the body processes over a long period. A suet dumpling dropped into a pint of salted broth and carried in a sealed tin to a mine gave a man a self-contained hot lunch that could be reheated against a steam pipe, delivered approximately 700 calories, and required no utensils. You ate the dumpling. You drank the broth. You went back to work. The broth mattered as much as the dumpling. In Welsh and Cornish mining communities in the 1860s and 1870s, The broth was typically made from whatever bones were available: beef neck bones, pork trotters, chicken carcasses, simmered for several hours until it was thick with gelatin and deep with flavor, then salted hard. The salt was deliberate. Underground, particularly in the wet mines, miners sweated constantly and lost sodium at rates that could cause dangerous cramping and disorientation. The heavily salted broth was a direct physiological intervention. The women who made it understood the relationship between salt loss and physical collapse without the vocabulary of electrolytes, but with complete practical comprehension of the effect. Number 10. Potted meat. Not the industrially processed paste in the tin. That came later and is a pale shadow of what is described here. Potted meat, as practiced in mining communities in Yorkshire, Pennsylvania, and later in the Kentucky and West Virginia coal country, was a method of preservation and concentration. Tough cuts, pig's head, beef cheek, ox tongue, chicken legs, were simmered for several hours until the meat fell completely off the bone and became tender enough to shred by hand. The shredded meat was then packed tightly into a small ceramic pot or tin, seasoned with salt, pepper, mace, and sometimes a small amount of vinegar, and covered with a thick layer of clarified fat that sealed the surface against air. Kept in a cool pantry, properly potted meat lasted several weeks. Packed in a miner's bucket, it lasted the entire shift and provided a concentrated protein and fat delivery in a form that could be eaten on bread, on oatcake, or straight from the pot. Number 9. Oxtail broth. The oxtail was not always the restaurant delicacy it has become. In 1890, in the mining communities of the Black Country in England and their transplanted counterparts in Pittsburgh and Youngstown, oxtail cost almost nothing because the butchers of the era considered it a secondary cut, prized mainly by the working poor and immigrant communities who understood from long practice that long simmering of a bony, collagen-rich cut produced a broth of extraordinary depth and body that could sustain several meals. For the miners, oxtail broth served a specific function beyond simple nourishment. It was the liquid in which other things were cooked: beans, potatoes, dumplings, barley, giving every component of the day's meal a flavor and a nutritional density that water-based cooking could not replicate. It was packed hot in a sealed tin flask, a glass-lined precursor to the modern thermos, and it was the thing that separated a cold lunch from something that felt, even at the bottom of a mine, like a meal worth eating. Number 8. Bacon and bean duff. Duff, from the English dough, was a boiled pudding, and among the most portable and calorie-dense foods that miners carried underground. In its mining form, bacon and bean duff was a dense suet pastry wrapped around a filling of salted bacon pieces, cooked dried beans and onion, tied tightly in a floured cloth, and boiled for approximately 90 minutes until the pastry was firm and the filling was cohesive. The result, when unwrapped and cut, was a compact cylindrical loaf of roughly 4 inches diameter that could be sliced and eaten cold with no preparation whatsoever. Each slice delivered a complete meal: protein from the beans and bacon, fat from the sweet and bacon fat, carbohydrate from the pastry, in a form that was structurally stable enough to survive the journey down a mine shaft in a bucket without disintegrating. Number 7. Herring and vinegar. The herring was the great working-class protein of the 19th and early 20th century, and nowhere was it more carefully deployed than in the mining communities of Scotland, Northumberland, and their American descendants in the coal fields of western Pennsylvania. Herring and vinegar, whole small herrings gutted and cleaned, packed in a jar with white or malt vinegar, bay leaf, peppercorns, and sometimes mustard seed, was a legitimate preservation technology. The acetic acid of the vinegar lowered the pH of the fish's flesh to a level at which bacterial growth was significantly inhibited, extending the safe life of the fish at room temperature from hours to weeks. A jar of vinegar herring made on Monday was still safe and good on Saturday in a cool pantry, and it was still safe and good in a warm mine on the day it was packed if it had been properly made. Number 6. Twice-baked bread. The French call it pain biscuit. The Italian tradition calls it frizzella. The Pennsylvania and West Virginia mining communities of the late 19th century called it hard bread or twice-baked loaf, and they made it specifically for the mine because it solved a problem that fresh bread could not solve: it lasted. Twice-baked bread was made by taking a fully baked loaf, typically a dense, slightly sour wheat loaf, slicing it into inch-thick slabs and returning the slices to a slow oven for 90 minutes to 2 hours until every trace of moisture had been driven out of the crumb and the slices had become hard, dry, and structurally rigid. The result could be packed in a tin bucket without absorbing moisture from the mine's atmosphere, would not mold, would not develop the soft, damp quality that made regular bread inedible underground after a few hours, and would last in a sealed tin for several days without any meaningful deterioration. Underground, the twice-baked bread was either eaten dry, harder than a cracker, requiring deliberate chewing that slowed consumption and, not incidentally, increased satiety, or briefly soaked in the hot broth or tea that came in the flask beside it. The soaking time was not long, 30 seconds in hot liquid, and the bread absorbed enough moisture to become palatable without losing its structure. Men who had been doing this for years developed a precise intuition for the soaking. Too short and the bread was still too hard to eat comfortably. Too long and it disintegrated into the broth and was lost. Number 5. Kidney pudding. Kidney pudding was specific to the English and Welsh mining tradition, and it was, in its best form, one of the great achievements of British working-class cooking. A suet pastry crust. The same dough used for the bacon and bean duff, made with beef sweet, flour, salt, and cold water, was lined into a small basin or tin filled with beef or lamb kidney cut into chunks with onion, flour, salt, pepper, and a splash of water, topped with a pastry lid, sealed and steamed for 3 to 4 hours until the pastry was firm and the kidney filling had cooked in its own steam into a rich, deeply flavored dense stew encased completely in pastry. The whole thing was then packed in its basin, carried to the mine, and eaten cold or reheated against a steam pipe or set near the carbide lamp. Kidney, as an organ meat, is among the most nutrient-dense foods available to the human diet. A single beef kidney, approximately half a pound, provides over 1,000% of the recommended daily intake of vitamin B, 400% of the recommended folate intake, and significant amounts of iron, zinc, riboflavin, and selenium. The miners eating kidney pudding twice a week were receiving nutritional support that their diet of bread and fat alone could not have provided. They were not eating kidney because they knew this. They were eating kidney because it was cheap and because it tasted good when it was made correctly, which it almost always was. There is a specific economic logic running through every one of these dishes that needs to be named plainly. Every entry on this list was built on the cuts, the parts, and the byproducts that the market did not want. Dripping was what accumulated at the bottom of the roasting pan. Oxtail was what the butcher sold last. Peas pudding was made from the dried legumes that stored indefinitely because no one was competing for them. The women who packed these buckets were not choosing inferior ingredients because they didn't know better. They were choosing the ingredients that the market undervalued and making them, through technique and accumulated knowledge, into food that was nutritionally superior to almost everything that the expanding industrial food system would eventually offer to replace them. The food industry's promise, convenience, consistency, abundance, delivered food that was easier and cheaper to produce than what came before it. What it did not deliver was better nutrition, better flavor, or better understanding of what a human body actually needs when it is working at its limit. The miners' wives were not replaced by a superior system. They were replaced by a cheaper one. Number 4. Miners' broth. Every culture that has ever had to keep a large group of people working under difficult conditions has arrived at some version of the same thing. A pot that is never completely emptied and never completely cleaned, to which something is always being added, from which something is always being taken. In the boarding houses that served the single male miners of the Pennsylvania coal country, the houses run by Polish and Italian and Welsh women who cooked for 8 to 12 men at a time, charged by the week, and built their entire economics on the gap between what the men paid and what the food cost. This pot was the center of the operation. Miners' broth, as practiced in these boarding houses in the 1890s and early 1900s, was not a recipe. It was a practice. The base was bones, whatever was cheapest that week, simmered with onion and any vegetable trimmings into a stock. Into this went whatever else was available: dried beans, barley, turnip, potato, cabbage, leftover pieces of salt pork, any meat scraps from the previous night's dinner. The result was different every day and always fundamentally the same. Dense, rich, deeply savory, filling in the way that only long-cooked bone broth can be filling, served in a tin cup or a heavy bowl with bread that the boarders themselves sometimes brought to the table. This was the meal that the men came home to after the shift. It was also sometimes what they carried down in the morning. A pint of hot broth in a sealed tin carried down 1,500 feet and drunk slowly in the dark at hour 5 of 12 was the meal that stood between a man and complete physical collapse. The boarding house operators who made this broth were not celebrated. They were enumerated in city directories as landladies. Their names appear in the census. Their recipes do not appear anywhere. Number 3. Fatback and greens. The southern coalfields, the mines of eastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, and southern West Virginia operated in a food culture that was distinct from the northern and immigrant traditions already described, and that culture produced its own mine food, built on the same principles but from different ingredients. Fatback is the cured salt pork from the dorsal side of the hog, fattier and less lean than side bacon, cheaper, more concentrated in caloric value, and in the Kentucky and Virginia mountains in the early 1900s, essentially a staple currency. A slab of fat back in a cast iron skillet rendered into pools of smoking pork fat. Into that fat went whatever greens were available: poke salad in spring, turnip greens and mustard in fall, dried beans cooked down with the fat through winter. The resulting combination of rendered pork fat and thoroughly wilted fat-coated greens was a daily reality for the mining families of Harlan County and Pike County, and McDowell County for decades. Number 2. Clapbread with potted char. This entry requires a small digression because both components of it are independently remarkable, and together they represent something that has vanished so completely that most people alive today have never encountered either half of it in its original form. Clapbread, oatmeal clapbread specifically, was a tradition of the Lake District in northern England that crossed the Atlantic with the Cumbrian miners who came to work the iron ore deposits of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the 1840s and 1850s. It was made by working oatmeal with a small amount of fat and just enough hot water into a stiff dough, then pressing the dough against a hot griddle with the hands, clapping it into a very thin, roughly circular cake that baked dry and became almost papery in texture, with a faint toasty quality from the direct griddle contact. The result was lighter than a standard oat cake, almost cracker-like, and packed without any concern for fragility because it was already essentially as hard and dry as it was ever going to get. The potted char was the other half. Arctic char is a cold water fish, the flesh pink and rich like salmon but milder. And in the Lake District of England, Windermere specifically, potted char was a regional delicacy going back to at least the 17th century. Char fillets poached gently in salted water, packed into small pots, and covered with spiced, clarified butter that set around the fish and sealed it completely. The method produced a preserved fish product of exceptional quality. The butter coating allowed no air to reach the fish. The mild spicing was complementary rather than overwhelming, and the result was clean, rich, deeply flavored. The Cumbrian miners brought both traditions with them to Michigan, where Lake Superior provided alternative species, lake trout and whitefish substituted for the char. And the method was adapted to local ingredients without losing its essential character. Number 1. The dinner bucket itself. This is not a dish, it is a system. And it is the most important thing on this list, and the most important thing that was lost. The dinner bucket, the tin pail that miners carried into the mines from the 1870s through the 1930s, was typically divided into 2 levels. The lower level held the hot food, the broth in its sealed tin, the suet pudding in its cloth, the pasty, or the dumplings. The upper level held the cold food, the bread, the oatcakes, the jar of pickled eggs, the potted meat. The flask sat separately, wrapped in a piece of cloth or newspaper to retain heat. Everything had its place. Everything was packed in an order that reflected a precise understanding of what a man needed, and when he needed it, across a 12-hour shift. The first thing eaten was always the hot broth or the hot tea, because beginning a cold morning underground with something warm was not comfort. It was physiological regulation, maintaining core temperature against the cold of the early descent before the heat of the deeper levels took over. The heaviest food, the pudding, the pasty, the dense bread, came at the midpoint of the shift, hour 6, when the initial blood sugar from the morning's dripping bread had been fully consumed and the second half of the work remained. The lightest food, the oatcakes, the pickled eggs, was saved for hour 9 or 10, when the appetite had diminished but the need for calories had not. Mary Dolan knew this. Every woman who packed a miner's bucket knew it. It was not written down anywhere. It was transmitted through watching. A daughter watched her mother pack the bucket and learned the sequence. She learned which lid had to seal tightly because the broth would spill, and which could be loosely placed because the bread needed to breathe. She learned that the oatcakes went on top of the bread, not under it, because the weight of the bread would crumble them by hour 2. She learned that the tea flask could not be packed directly against the pasty, or the pasty would absorb condensation and go soggy before it was eaten. She learned all of this without being taught it formally, because it was not a formal education. It was a tradition. When the company cafeteria replaced the dinner bucket, the men ate the same food as each other. Portions set by a kitchen manager, sequences determined by convenience, nutrition calibrated to a general average rather than to a specific man doing a specific job at a specific depth. The cafeteria was cleaner and cheaper and more efficient, and it fed more men faster, and it obliterated, in one institutional decision, the entire system of knowledge that those women had built over 60 years. The bucket itself was the last to go. After the cafeteria came, some men still carried their buckets, out of habit, out of preference, out of the specific personal knowledge that their wife's cooking was better than the cafeteria's and kept them going longer. By 1950, the buckets were mostly gone. By 1970, they were antiques. They sit now in mining museums in Butte and Scranton and Iron Mountain and Houghton, their lids slightly dented, their interiors still faintly dark with the residue of 1,000 meals packed in the dark before dawn. If your family worked the mines, if your great-grandparents came from the anthracite regions or the copper country or the coal hollows of Kentucky, there is a chance that someone in your family's memory knows something of this. Ask before it's gone. The woman who packed that bucket knew more about feeding a working body than almost anything modern nutritional science has formally documented. Her knowledge was not written down. It lives, if it lives at all, in the oldest people you know. Which of these would you eat? Tell us in the comments. And if your family still makes any of these, the black bread, the fat back and greens, the pasty in the right way, don't let it end with you.